Welcome to this little Bible study for today. It's been a while since I took a look at one of these passages with a camera, and today I decided to pull it out and open up to whatever passage might be here. And we happen to be in Zechariah chapter 12, and Zechariah is part of the minor prophets, or in other words, one of the prophets who wrote shorter books. There's a number of them toward the end of the Old Testament. And a lot of them speak, some to Israel and other to other nations. This one here is the oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Now, a couple things that stand out right away is that we're looking at this idea of an oracle. And I don't think a lot of people associate oracles with Christianity. However, there is an oracle, and the oracle is given by, it's like if we say it's the oracle of I think there was a famous one in Greece, the Oracle of Greece. This is the oracle of the word of the Lord. And there's a couple ways of looking at word, and in our English translations, the idea of word often carries the significance of a word, like thus is a word. However, here, and particularly in your more ancient context, you have the appearance of this concept, the word of the Lord. And I think John makes use of this when you get to the New Testament, when he says, in the beginning was the Word. So some people will look at this and they'll say, the oracle of the word of the Lord, meaning that the word of the Lord is actually an early manifestation of the Christ. So we have the oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord. So we have the word of the Lord saying, thus declares the Lord. Kind of odd to be speaking in third person. However, you see the word of the Lord and the Lord may actually be distinct from one another. Thus declares the Lord. This one is a particular Lord, the one who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth. I'd be really curious to see this word Lord often is associated, actually I think God more so, with Elohim. So I'm curious, Lord perhaps is then Jehovah, or the very particular God that you see functioning in the Old Testament. This is the particular one who stretched out the heavens. Now, from a scientific standpoint, we know that the heavens, at least what we observe with the telescope, appear to still be being stretched out. This says it's already done, in a sense, stretched out the heavens. At least if we're looking at this literally, that's kind of an interesting concept, that what God has already completed, we are still observing as being in process. And I think that might actually have significance, particularly when we look at a number of other passages and the New Testament idea of the kingdom of God being here, but yet not being seen in its fullness. So we have, who stretched out the heavens, founded the earth, and formed the spirit of man within him. One thing that's been interesting to me in my studies lately has been a focus on the book of Genesis, and how the Lord formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living spirit. And then you have in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, you have the Spirit poured out. And so I've been really curious about, all right, what is this spirit of man that we see at the beginning? And this is really interesting because now we can use the book of Zechariah to interpret the book of Genesis. Now, it'd be even more helpful if we were looking at this in Hebrew. But see, look at this. Here's another reference to my spirit shall not abide in man forever. And that's in Genesis 6 when you have God is getting ready to send the flood upon the earth. And then you have back in Genesis 1, God created man. Now, go to Genesis 2, we have the details. Breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. So God breathed, so the Spirit of God breathed into man, and the man became a living creature. And that living creature thing is referred to in Genesis a few times with regard to the Spirit. So I'm curious here that we have something called the Spirit of man. And then we have three things. We have the heavens, we have the earth. Also, note, heavens are plural here. Very interesting. So we're not just talking about the sky. Stretched out the heavens, founded the earth, formed the spirit of man. So this is a God who interacts with all these different dimensions of reality. And here's what he has to say. Behold, I'm about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. Wow. All right, this guy is laying in right away. Zechariah, nice job. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. So Jerusalem was the capital city in Judah, which was the southern part of the split in the nation of Israel. On that day, the day when Jerusalem is made a cup of staggering and there's a siege against Jerusalem, that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. So when we start looking at things like all the peoples, this is making me think this passage is looking pretty big picture. We have a reference to that day, which is often used in futuristic prophecies, and we start to get into some interesting eschatological ideas, which eschatology is like how things come to an end. So on that day, Jerusalem will be a heavy stone. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves. And all the nations of the earth, all the nations of the earth. And you know, Bible scholars, they will debate about this, whether all the nations of the earth is kind of a hyperbole, as in saying everyone's going to the party, because really not everyone is going to do anything. We could say everyone is a person, or something like that. And this is saying all the nations of the earth are going to be gathered against Jerusalem. There's going to be a siege. So it sounds to me like war. There's a particular day, and we have a repeated phrase, on that day, declares the Lord. So when we get into prophecies are somewhat poetic. In other words, they use a lot of imagery to communicate their point. Prophecies aren't necessarily always specific, like we think of as a scientific specificity, this many percent of this people, and you can narrow it down to exactly what's going on. Oftentimes, you're going to have stories, you're going to have imagery, all trying to communicate something about the future that if somebody were to say exactly what was going on, like if the prophet was to try to say somebody was going to bring a gun to the battle, nobody back in that day would have any idea what's going on. So here we're using imagery. On that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic. Now this is pretty clear imagery, particularly given that the prophet is speaking to people who understand horses are mostly used for war, and it's rider with madness. But for the sake of the house of Judah. This is interesting though. Notice that for the sake of the house of Judah, but the oracle is concerning Israel. Could probably get super sidetracked because there are particular covenants that were made with the kings of Judah, with David, with Solomon, and with some who came after, I think even Hezekiah, and perhaps Josiah, all kings of Judah. And so Judah is the ruling tribe of Israel. For the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open when I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. So the horses are struck with panic, riders with madness, and then we have blindness. Then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts, their God. This is why I love the Bible, because there is hope in here. There is this idea that even though all the nations of the world are gathered against this one city, on that day, the Lord is doing something. And I'm going to see if I can find it, because I was reading in First Chronicles just this past week, and there was a story. You know what? It must have been Second Chronicles, because there's a story in the days of Hezekiah. Oh, also, look, we're just passing by Solomon's dedication of the temple, and Solomon prays and asks God that if people are having some trouble and they turn and pray toward the temple, that God will deliver them. And this applied not only to people from Israel, but to people outside of Israel. Kind of wish I had made a little video of that. But here we have Hezekiah. He's doing all of these things, and he's repairing the house of God, and he's is really seeking. Look at this. They're celebrating the Passover, and they're even figuring out how to do it when they basically reformed back to the worship of God in last minute. Didn't have time to keep the Passover, so they kept it the second month, which was a provision Moses had made. These guys were doing everything, give themselves to the law of the Lord, give in abundance. Like, there is this turning back to God, and you have the king of Assyria coming against Judah. So this is where the Bible really fits together in so many ways, in that you have this historical section. It's basically, here's what happened, here's what the king did, here's what the priest did, and here's what the neighboring enemy king did. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah, camped against the fortified cities. So they solve this. They're making preparations to defend the Millos, the city of David. This is Jerusalem. So anybody who's looking at this this language that Zechariah is using, they're going to understand. There's going to be almost like a visceral understanding of, oh my gosh, remember when Sennacherib came against Hezekiah, and like we were all going to die because he was destroying all of the other nations around there. And Hezekiah speaks to his people and says, "Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him, for there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and fight our battles." And the people took confidence from the words of Hezekiah. Now, here then, Sennacherib says Hezekiah is misleading you, saying the Lord our God will deliver us. And Sennacherib is confused because he says, has not the same Hezekiah taken away his high places and his altars? And what he doesn't realize is that Hezekiah had gotten rid of all of the other gods, but not the Lord. And so were the gods of the nations of those lands at all able to deliver their lands out of my hand? For no god of any nation or kingdom has been able to deliver his people from my hand or the hands of my fathers. Just this fascinating story. And look what happened. The Lord sent an angel. So Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, Isaiah is another one of the writers here, prayed because of this and cried to heaven, and the Lord sent an angel to cut off all the mighty warriors and commanders and officers in the camp of the king of Assyria, so he returned with shame of face to his own land. So here's what happened. And many brought gifts to the Lord, to Jerusalem, and precious things to Hezekiah, king of Judah, so that he was exalted in the sight of, see this phrase again, all nations. So here we do have the ability to question all the nations of the earth. Like, it seems pretty explicit that like every nation that exists in the earth is coming, but you also have then Hezekiah, which I'm really doubting that like the Incan Empire and the Aztecs and like the Chinese and everybody else who was a long way away from Jerusalem was bringing gifts across the oceans. I don't know if they were even crossing oceans back in those days. However, everyone who had gathered against Jerusalem, and particularly this king of Assyria, which was a powerful nation in that day, is looking at this. The clans of Judah and beyond are saying, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts, their God. And I'm looking at this, and today's, I think I'm actually going to stop here. It's unbelievable how much you get in just this tiny little section of one of the prophets, of a random page that you turn to in the Bible. But I've been feeling a little bit depressed about the state of the world and how, power corrupts leadership, and how so many people are taken advantage of and oppressed. And just looking at this, saying, there is still a God. There's this revelation of this God, the Lord of hosts, their God, this God of Israel, the one who is revealed in the Bible, the one who loves justice, the one who cares for the oppressed and for his people, is able to do this. Is able to give strength to his people. To the ones who are surrounded, who have no hope, there is hope. Well, that'll be it for today, but I look forward to joining you again soon.